Hello, everybody. My name is Fiona Coyne. I'm a textile sourcing specialist, and I'm here today to speak to you about what I see as being the opportunities, but also the challenges facing the textile industry in West Africa. I have had the privilege of visiting and working in the West African countries, also in much of Asia, over the last 15 years in the textiles industry. I in no way claim to be an expert on West African textiles, absolutely not. But I do have, I feel, some very useful experiences and some insights that may provide you with a different viewpoint. What I'd specifically like to talk about is the opportunities and challenges. Now, over the last 15 years, I was working for the Flisco Group. I think most of you may know it, Wax Hollandais. So Flisco produced in the Netherlands, wax prints like what I'm wearing. Also Uniwax in Ivory Coast, GTP in Ghana, Woodin. I had considerable experience purchasing the grey cloth that they needed for their products. I've also been very much involved in, I was also director for sourcing and CSR. The CSR part of it, corporate social responsibility, took me all the way to the cotton fields of Nigeria and Benin, looking at very small scale farms and trying to work out how we could better use the cotton that is produced locally in the products we were producing. So let's look at, first of all, how the cotton becomes a garment step by step. What do you need generally? It's fairly logical, cotton. Having grown the cotton, it's then picked and then taken to a gin. Logically, you need a huge volume of cotton to produce cotton lint. So you're talking about very bulky goods that have to be transported to a fairly large factory, the gin, where the cotton fibers are separated from the husks, the stalks, everything else. Then comes spinning, which is obviously, that's where the cotton lint is made into thread. This is now a very high-tech speciality. Then we have weaving. After that, printing and dyeing. Then finally, garment making. And the three key things that are essential every step of the way is power, people, and infrastructure. So you need people to grow and produce the cotton. You need infrastructure to transport it to the gin, where you need people to operate the gin, which of course needs power to run. Then of course it needs to be transported to wherever it's going to be spun, which again needs people, power, infrastructure. Spinning is incidentally extremely power intensive, as is weaving. Weaving is very, very critical. And what you see here are not old-fashioned looms. These are much more modern looms. And you have to bear in mind that power has to be 24/7 and uninterrupted, because practically or technically, if you have to stop the loom, you have a huge inefficiency in your production, because air jet looms run on compressed air, and it takes an additional half hour to reset the air compressors. Furthermore, if your loom stops unexpectedly during production, you receive you end up with what they call a thin bar, which is a defect in the material. So you don't want that, because no matter what you're doing with it, printing, dyeing, etc., you're always going to see that defect. Once again, from weaving to printing and dyeing, quite often you're going to need transport. You also need power, people for the printing and dyeing. And the garment making, of course, that is the one where a lot of work is involved. And for that, we definitely need people. And don't forget, cotton growing requires a certain skill. Ginning requires a certain skill. Modern spinning requires skilled workers, because these are highly sensitive machines. For weaving, the same applies. These are Ferraris of the weaving world. And when it comes to printing, dyeing, and garment making, again, considerable skills are required. Now, before we go further, there's just a few things that I think would be interesting for you to bear in mind. African cotton is generally medium plus staple length and hand picked. Now, what does that mean? Medium plus means that it's suitable for wax prints up to fairly fine shirting. The very fine cotton with the long fibers, that's Egyptian cotton or Xinjiang cotton. Also in Ivory Coast, there's some very, very good cotton, Burkina Faso, Mali. But generally, the African cotton tends to be above average in terms of quality, and hand-picked means that labor, of course, that means jobs are produced, many more jobs than if it were machine-picked. 90% of the West African cotton crop is exported. This will become important as I go a little further into my presentation, but just please bear that figure in mind. Ocean freight accounts for 3% of global emissions worldwide. What I notice in West Africa is that relatively little cloth is actually produced in West Africa. So there's lots of cotton, there's lots of garments, but the garments are coming from somewhere else. That means that cotton from West Africa is sent somewhere else to be processed and then sent back again, thus contributing to global emissions. Now some figures. A printing mill producing 20 million meters annually would normally have spent around $250,000 on freight from Asia, because most of the grey cloth comes from Asia. In 2021, thanks to the increased freight cost as a result of the pandemic, this figure will be about $1 million more. Now, for any mill operating in West Africa, that is a huge amount of money. If you export cotton and then bring it back in cloth form, you're going to have to pay import duty on it. Now, every country has different regulations here, but you're looking at more or less 15% on the value of the cotton, even if it was originally from West Africa. When you consider that the value of the cotton tends to make up about a third of the value of the cloth, this is a fairly significant amount of money. If you're looking at a spinning weaving mill capable of producing enough cloth, so for this 20 million meters per year, the amount of cotton that mill needs is, if you're looking on the average, the fairly small West African farms, that's enough cotton to produce a living for about 40,000 farmers and their families and employees. And bear in mind, 20 million meters may sound like quite a lot, but it's not. An average mill is 25 million. I can think of CCAM, I can think of CBT, I can think of, there's a spinning and weaving, obviously. I can think of Uniwax, GTP, UNTL in Nigeria. And that's just a fraction, because remember how much is imported, how much of the wax prints, how many other clothes are imported into West Africa. Very interesting for me, and I was really working with CMIA, that's Cotton Made in Africa. Most West African cotton is grown according to Cotton Made in Africa standards. Now, Cotton Made in Africa is, I feel, a very interesting organization in that they stimulate cotton to be grown without irrigation, with as little pesticides and artificial fertilizers as possible. And they actually train farmers to create or to produce their own organic pesticides and fertilizers, if possible. That reduces the cost, it's environmentally friendly, and above all, it brings benefit to small farmers. And at the moment, Cotton Made in Africa supports around 1 million smallholders across West and East Africa. Now, I've visited the cotton fields in Nigeria, which were producing for Cotton Made in Africa, and it's very interesting to see the difference that little steps, incremental steps can make. Just looking at the West African market, the domestic market is enormous. So there's plenty of offset possibilities. Furthermore, the time to Europe in terms of freight is just 3 weeks, which is considerably shorter than the transit time from Asia, where most of the clothes in the world still come from. Let's now look at the current situation in West Africa when it comes to cotton to garment. Cotton, we have in abundance, of course, but 90% is exported, as I already said. Ginning, yes, there are gins, but many of them are fairly old, outdated. And if you imagine what a gin does to the cotton, it sort of mashes it around to get the fibers, to separate the fibers from the rest. And if you have a very old gin that is perhaps not optimally maintained, you're actually going to damage the fibers. So there's quite a lot of investment that's needed here. Spinning, same story. Much of the, or most of the factories in West Africa can only spin yarn of a specific yarn count, which means the thickness of the yarn, which is relatively coarse and not suitable for anything like, for instance, fine men's shirts or home textiles. Huge investment is required in this field. Weaving, unfortunately, the same story. Modern weaving looms, the airjet looms about which I spoke, they operate at many times the speed of the old shuttle looms. The quality of the cloth they produce is infinitely better. Longer pieces, fewer weaving defects is what you need for fine sheeting, fine shirting, etc., etc. So there's virtually none. The equipment is extremely outdated. So we can actually more or less, when you look at the number of factories that exist in West Africa, you can more or less cut out this part of the chain. Printing and dyeing, yes, there is. And of course, there's a lot of small scale, but there is quite a lot of industrial printing and dyeing. So but there's huge scope for expansion here. And when it comes to garment making, particularly on industrial scale, the same thing applies. And then comes the really interesting bit. The PPI, that's the power, the people and the infrastructure. Just getting cotton to a gin is a phenomenal task. Even if a farmer, a smallholder, only produces about 1 ton. When I was visiting the cotton growing areas in Abeokuta in Nigeria, just the infrastructure to get that 1 ton of cotton to the local gin was significantly lacking. So project that on a scale of the whole of West Africa. And of course, there's going to be areas with better infrastructure, but there are also many places where the infrastructure is not as developed as it needs to be. That's a problem. Power, when it comes to the spinning and specifically weaving, as I already said, power has to be 24/7. Otherwise, you're going to face problems with the quality of what you're producing, not to mention the efficiency. For printing and dyeing, the power is important. It's less crucial, but it's still, if you stop, if your power stops halfway through a printing run, then you're also going to have faults. So it's bad quality. It's not efficient. Garment making, obviously, you need electricity to power the sewing machines, for the lighting, etc., etc. And the people element. This is a really interesting one. There are all over West Africa, there are people very much in need of jobs. But of course, they have to be trained because, as I said, these machines require people who have a significant level of skill, and that takes time to develop. And just think, what would it mean to the West African workforce and the economy if 100% of the cotton crop were to be processed locally rather than being exported? Look at the 6 steps. At the moment, 1 and 2 are okay in Africa, fine. 3 and 4 are virtually non-existent, and 5 and 6 are there, but could be significantly increased. And that would bring benefits to so many people and thus the local economies. So to summarize, the opportunities and challenges. Start processing the 90% of the cotton crop that is currently being exported at home in West Africa, because that will create jobs. That will allow the value added arising from processing to be earned at home rather than abroad. There's a whole load of financing that's being missed out on, jobs that are being lost to other countries, and they could be being done in West Africa. Furthermore, reduce the environmental impact of transporting cotton around the globe. It seems a little silly to ship nearly 90% of the cotton crop largely to Asia and then send it back again in the form of cloth that will then be printed and made into garments. And I see this as the main thing. I mean, Africa, West Africa really has the possibility, the potential to be the next sustainable textiles production hub. Everything is there, but there are a few hurdles. Of course, there always are. Without them, life would be easy, right? And if it were easy, everybody would be doing it. Infrastructure. This really is a significant issue. For instance, just take yarn. Transporting yarn. You may not think that yarn is anything very special, but it's transported on big cones, which are palletized. you can't just stuff them in and out of lorries and throw them around. They need to be transported like porcelain, because if you bump into the edge of a pallet of yarn, you're going to damage every single fiber on every single cone, or every single strand of yarn on every single cone. And that means when you weave it, you're going to have a great chance of breakages, which means bad quality and thus lower efficiency. You need to get the infrastructure developed to allow you to transport goods like that without mud, potholes, logistics that just aren't working very well. So this is a really, really big challenge, and huge investment is needed. A lot is being done, but more has to be done. Power. I was working in Nigeria trying to set up a textile plant there, and the big issue is power. I mentioned already that 24/7 power is needed. Spinning and weaving in particular requires significant amounts of power. And if you have power cuts, that immediately has a negative impact on your production efficiency and the quality. Also, the cost of power in West Africa is relatively high, and that adds to the cost of production. The investment needed to upgrade the various facilities is significant. Bear in mind that many factories were built about 50 plus years ago, and they have old technology. The new technology is much more expensive, factor 10 compared to the old technology. There are, however, numerous possibilities. For instance, when I look at the weaving looms that are available, some of the top brands like Toyota and Picanol, Tsudokoma, they now have their own B brands being produced largely in China, which are similar machines, but a third of the price. And absolutely adequate for home textiles, shirting, and for the local goods that's like your local wax prints, etc., etc. They're good looms, and they're a bit sturdier and a bit less sensitive than some of the very high-tech ones. Other things that come up when you look at the investment required from a financial perspective, from an outsider's perspective, if you're going to come and invest, you're going to want some guarantees as to the possibility of importing the machinery you need, for instance, without having to pay import duty on it. Perhaps the possibility of importing raw materials that aren't locally available, and also things like repatriation of profits. People want to be sure that whatever they're doing is going to be able to deliver its fruits, and for them to take some of their money out again, as well as reinvesting it. Then, of course, there's the question of how to train the workforce, the local workforce, to cope with high-tech machines. If you're an investor, you're going to need some assurances that you will be able to import a certain amount of skilled labor to train the new laborers, the local ones. So it will be more or less one-to-one at the beginning, and there has to be very clear from the local government perspective what the regulations are. Then, of course, there's the question of regional instability. West Africa is a place where things tend to change very quickly, and it can be quite volatile, and that scares quite a lot of investors. But they're not insurmountable, and the benefits are absolutely there. And I just say, where there's a will, there's a way, and I would love to see West Africa become what I say it should be, the next sustainable textiles production hub, and I would love to play a part in that. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, please feel free. The organization will let you know how to contact me, and thank you once again. Bye-bye.